Willkommen, bienvenue, and welcome back to the Modding of Isaac with Lyte. And today's episode is on runes. It's also going to cover a couple of other things, but the primary focus is on adding custom runes with the giant book animation. Now, there are a couple of little things that aren't quite 100% there, but I think they're close enough. So let's get started, see what we've got. Going to start a new run. We'll use Isaac, why not? Here we are, Curse of Darkness. I've got it set in the code that it'll always be Curse of Darkness, because one of the runes is going to get rid of that for us. So first, we go in and we're going to spawn ourselves a rune. Now, it doesn't show in the console the various runes appropriately, but if you go with say 32, pretty sure that should be Yera. Hagalaz, I was a little off. We try 33. Yera, good. 34. Ear, what? Try 34 again. Awaz, that's right. We've got a bait and switch going on, such that when you spawn a rune of that shape, it has a chance to turn into the rune that I want it to be. That's true of both the pointy runes and the dull runes. So if we go for, I think it's 53, that's our shiny new one. Hagal. It's derived from the same rune as Hagalaz, but it's from the older Futhark. So we've got Ear, which is Cleanse, and Hagal, which is Illumination. So we're here in the dark. Let's turn on some lights. So you had the giant book animation that brings that giant image towards you. You get some fireworks, and it cures Curse of Darkness. Now, Ear is a little bit different. Might be Ear. I don't know the runes all that well. This one, it gets rid of costumes. So let's give item Abaddon. Abaddon's got a nice full body costume. Give item, how about Dr. Fetus? Give us a nice little hat. So if at some point you're like, man, I don't like looking like this anymore, just use the rune and boop, it cleans off your costumes. Now, you're still black, because that's not a costume. That's actually a sprite sheet change. So if you want to have things that make you these colors, you're actually changing the fundamental sprite sheet of the character. And so you'll need to know what character you are and which sprite sheet you want to become. It's a whole big old messy thing. But that's essentially what it's going to do. I'm going to hit R such that we don't have those fireworks going through the entire episode. Let's head over to the code, see how to make this happen. Sorry about the cough. It's not going away. So here we are in pocketitems.xml. So in our good old-fashioned mod here, in resources, we've got various things. In content, we've got pocket items. Pocket items are pills and cards and runes. Starts off with pocket items. There's no version, there's no nothing. It's just basic XML, closes pocket items. We have two runes here, so you start with rune. If you want a card, you start with card. If you want pill, you start with pill. You give it the description that shows up underneath the name. So Ear is Cleanse, Hagal is Illumination. Name is what is displayed across the top. So Ear and Hagal. HUD, however, is crucial. I love that word. Had a professor once who used it, said it just like that. Crucial. But it serves two purposes. One is for telling it what your rune or card looks like when you're holding it. And that's what you find in the code. So if you've tried to get card ID by name and you didn't have the HUD, it was giving you -1, and that's why all of your card effects were being triggered all at once, because it didn't know which one was which. You have to set the HUD or it's not going to work. Even though in the old-fashioned resources. If you go into pocket items here, and you scroll down to the runes, they don't have a HUD. No HUD for the runes because they're just runes. For modded runes, you need the HUD. It's not going to work. So that's step 1. Step 2, we're going to go through our mod folder and look at all of the various and sundry things we've added to get to this point. So in content, we've got GFX this time, which is cardfronts.anim2 and cardfronts2.ping. So if we head over into the animation editor, we've got it open here. This is UI cardfronts2. The sprite sheet I've got here just has the runes from the regular old resources. If you look at the animations, we've got Ir and we've got Hoggle. All they are is just static versions of the 2 types of runes. This is what's going to show up in the bottom right-hand corner when you're holding the item. So if you want to make something that isn't a card or a rune, at least doesn't look like them, you can make them look however you like. They just have to be roughly 16 by 24. And they'll be used when you press Q or whichever bumper you use on the controller. And then you define them as if they were a card, because runes act like cards. So this animation editor part for the UI card fronts, super easy. You just replace the sprite sheet, you set it up with the animation names. I duplicated the card anim2 here, and then just replaced it, changed those 2, and we're good to go. I've got this PSD here just because that's how I edited it. I use Photoshop. And then this .ping, just those images. If we come back here, we've got main.lua as always, but in resources, we've also got some things in GFX, because we're going to need a couple of anim2 files to make everything work. So these 005, 303, and 304 are the anim2 files for the rune on the ground. This is the entity of a rune in existence, because the game doesn't make them look like a rune by default. I don't know why, but it makes them look like a playing card. So we need these anim2 files to be able to force them to look like runes. And then if we go into UI, here we've got cards and pills with the card fronts, the pills, and the star flash. So if we open up this one, let's go back to the animation editor, let's open that one up. Resources, GFX, UI, cards and pills. So here in cards and pills, we've got the various types of pills. We've got the various types of cards, all 2 of them. But there's a lot of things in here that can come in handy. And if we look at the sprite sheet, we've got all sorts of interesting, useful images here. So we're going to work with this as well, because this, I mean, there are just so many things that need to happen in this mod. And then with the giant book, we've got the animation of it pushing forward towards you, and then we just use image editing to make these images what we want them to be, and then I'll show you in the code how to make it do what it needs to do. Whew, so many things. But that's the list of all of the various files you're going to need. I took everything in resources from the resources folder that you extracted from the game. Pretty much everything. Like this giant book 2, I just took it straight from resources. So if you come over into resources and go to GFX and then UI and then giant book, in here are all the giant book things and their various giant book anims. We're just using regular giant book, not giant book big. Giant book big works at least slightly differently. I may have... Yeah, it looks like I moved it instead of copying it, because it was just gone. But I didn't actually edit giantbook.anim2. You don't have to. All we do is swap out the sprite sheet. So, those are all the files. Now we have to write some code to make the files do what we want. As always, mod, register mod. I call this one Bluetooth because I was originally going to make it a play on the, is it Danish king who inspired the Bluetooth technology with the runes of his name? He ate too many blueberries? Who knows? Then game is game. Now, we only need to set up Giant Book once. Just like we did with the custom pickups, we can load the anim2 just once and then tell it to do different things at different times as needed. So Giant Book is a sprite, and then when we first create it, we load in giantbook.anim2. And then this false is saying don't load the graphics because those aren't the ones you're going to need anyway. Then we set up some constants. We get card ID by name from ear. Remember, this is the HUD, not the name. So if you've got a rune that has multiple words in it, separated by spaces in the name, your HUD is likely going to be all compressed together, and that's what goes here. And then we get the same for Hoggle. We set a couple of convenience constants here. Rune 1 and Rune 2 are referencing the anim2 files for the entity Rune 1 and Rune 2, the pointy one and the dull one. Ear chance is the probability of doing the bait and switch to make the rune ear. 0.5 is just for demonstration purposes. It makes it such that I can show you that both normal runes and modded runes do show up. You'll want to scale this back a lot, because right now every other rune is going to be a modded one, and that's not a good distribution. So you'll want to change this going forward. And then rune cooldown we have, because there are a lot more weird situations with runes than there are with entities and collectibles. With entities, you can do a bait and switch with no problems, no complications. Because you summon it, it comes into existence, and its only option from there is kill or be killed. It's not going into your pocket and coming back out. It's not moving all over the place and being resummoned. It only exists once. Runes, however, have so many different ways of existing, because they'll come into existence. Sure, fine, do a bait and switch. But they could be dropped from the player, either actively or when you pick up a different rune. You don't want to do a bait and switch when that happens, because then you could just scum it up and get the modded rune that you want, just by picking up and dropping it over and over and over again. You don't want to bait and switch when you use the Yara, because you want to get the same rune again. If you Yara an Awaz, you don't want to get an ear out of it. No. So we need to do a lot of things to make sure that it only does the bait and switch when it's supposed to. Some of that's not entirely straightforward. Okay, so we've got a big old post-p-effect update. We've got a small post-render. Then we've got 2 use cards, and then just this little bit at the end to make sure it was always Curse of Darkness. You don't actually need this part at the end. Whew. So we're going to start at the bottom. We're going to show you how the runes work when you use them. Then we'll go back to how you make the runes exist. So right here, add callback, MC use card on Hoggle. So we've got mod on Hoggle, and then we filter it by the card's ID, which you need to make sure the HUD was set, or else this will trigger for every card. Now, you'll notice something a little different about this function. I put in 3 dots. That ellipsis will accept any number of arguments, because I don't care what the card function is sending me. We know it's triggering when someone uses the Hoggle rune. Whatever it tells me is not particularly interesting. It's telling me what card was used, but I don't need it. So I just put this here. It takes in whatever it sends, and then I promptly ignore it. You could do the same with an underscore, any variable really. But this way, I don't have to concern myself with how many things are passed. Then, Isaac.getPlayer0 gets the player, then :animate card does a card animation. So since Isaac.getPlayer returns a reference to the player, you can use that as if it were a player, which we use the : and animate card to say, hey player, do a card animation. Which one? Use item, which holds it up but not too high, and then card rune answers. I use answers because it's the dull rune. You could pick any of the dull runes. Yera is a sharp rune. You use any of the sharp runes, doesn't much matter. But that's going to hold it up but not too high. Then we're going to trigger the giant book animation. So we take giant book, we replace the sprite sheet with hoggle.ping. So that's the big old it kind of looks like an asterisk, really. But it's got a straight up and down and the X on it. So that's our hoggle rune. And so we take layer 0, or sprite sheet 0, and replace it with our hoggle ping. So it's still the same animation, but a different sprite sheet. And we tell it to load the graphics such that it knows that that's the picture that's going, and then we play the appear animation. There are several animations in there. Appear is the one that just comes towards you. There's also one that shakes. Look in the animation editor to see what the different things are, and then we say true to force it just because that we want that to play right now. Now, this is not enough to make it work, but this is enough to make it start. The rest of it is done elsewhere in the code, and I'll tell you what those are when we get there, but I'm warning you that if you only do this part, you will see nothing. Okay? Now, this local player thing is a holdover from earlier code. It would be better written like this, because originally these were in different parts of the code and I consolidated and didn't rewrite everything. So player, Isaac, player, voila. Then this is the one that cures darkness and fires off fireworks. So we do Isaac.spawn entity type entity effect. So type 1000. Effect variant fireworks. Effects are things that you don't actually collide with. So creep on the ground, fireworks firing off. Subtype 0, no subtype. We spawn them where the player is, they're not moving, and nothing spawned them. So that's the fireworks. And then to remove the curse, we take the game, we request the level, and then we tell it to remove the curse. Which one? Level curse, curse of darkness. I think they fixed the level curse enumeration such that they are the appropriate bit masks now, so if you go back to my curses episode, it might not be 100% accurate. You might be able to just get away with using the level curse directly. Thank goodness. And then for the year rune, it's pretty much the same thing. We take this and we move it back up here for good measure. No sense getting the player twice. We do the same thing where we animate holding up the card, but not too high. Replace the sprite sheet with the year rune, load the graphics, play appear. Again, this doesn't actually get the job done. It just starts the process. And then to clear off all the costumes, all you do is player : clear costumes. Poof, they're all gone. So if at some point you want to have an item that completely reskins the character and gets rid of all other costumes, you do this first and then apply yours. So if you want to be a cute little dragon that doesn't have any of the other shenanigans, you clear the other costumes and apply yours. Either every frame, every time someone picks up an item. I'm not entirely certain of the best way to do it, but this is at least the starting point. So that's using the runes themselves. They start the process of rendering the giant book. So then we move up just a little more to on render. So this is post-render, the screen has been displayed. Now we want to render our own things. So mod add callback, MC post-render, mod on render. Our function, mod on render. What do? We check if the giant book is playing appear. Because if it's not finished playing that, then we should render it. That means it's still playing it. I tried some different versions of this, but this one seems to be the most reliable. So if you're not finished playing up here, which is what we told it to play down here, then Giant Book render layer 0. So we're saying render that basic layer. Now this next bit is interesting. Isaac.world to render position. Because you can render anywhere you like. So if you've got strange screen dimensions, you can render anywhere on that strange screen. So we need to take world coordinates and turn them into render coordinates, such that we're actually drawing it in the same place relative to what you see in the game. And then you give it the world coordinates. I give it 320, 300, because that gets me the results that I like. Now this true is, I think, for rounding off to nice whole numbers. So you take this, you give it world coordinates, and it converts them into render coordinates. If your screen is normal aspect ratio, then the render coordinates are the same. But if somebody plays it on a different shaped screen than you, it would render differently without this function. So whenever you're rendering straight to the screen, it's probably best to use this function. So when we were doing the thing with the pickups, we probably needed this as well. I just didn't know it existed, and I didn't test it for the different screen configurations. So this is kind of important. So what this does is it renders this book to the screen. Great! Still not done yet. There's a piece of this that's missing that we're not doing in here either. Because these giant book animations are not rendered at 60 FPS. At least not for me. They're rendered at 30 FPS. Which is weird because the rest of the game's at 60. And this render function is at 60. But the giant book is done at 30, so if you try to render it at 60 FPS, it looks weird. Too smooth. So we actually tell it how fast to animate somewhere else entirely. So this giant book animation happens in 3 different places. Whew. Split across quite a bit of the world. So where's the last piece? Well, it's here in this passive effect update, or player effect update, whichever. Right here, giant book update. This is what tells it to go to the next frame. If you put it in render, it'll do it at 60 FPS or however many FPS the game is running at. If you do it on update, it'll run it at 30. It'll run it at the update rate, which is more similar to the way the runes are done in the game. Again, it's a personal preference. If you like it at 60, do it at 60. I like it at 30. So that's what this giant book update is doing here. So we've done tons of this p-effect updates. You just give it your function. Here's your function, which gives player to you. So you don't have to worry about doing Isaac get player 0. So we're updating the giant book. That's what causes it to step forward in the animation. Runs it at 30 FPS. We're going to skip all the way down here, because here is where we set the rune cooldown. We take it and we decrement it every time. So rune cooldown is math.max of 0 and rune cooldown, which means it'll go down to 0 and stop at 0. It'll never go below 0. So those are the 2 ends of this post-update player. Okay. Now all the rest of this is just going through the entities in the room and deciding what to do with them. You ready? Let's go. So we've got the same loop that we've always had. Underscore entity in pairs, Isaac get room entities. If you like the other form better, where you use for I equals 1, comma, number of entities, do, and then using entities, bracket I, and bracket, that's fine. Use whatever is comfortable for you. I like it this way, because you're working with one entity at a time instead of trying to shuffle through a box of entities. So we grab each entity one at a time, and we check if the entity's type is pickup. and whether its variant is tarot card, because tarot cards, playing cards, and runes all have the same variant, 300. The specific type of card or rune or whatever is the subtype. And if you scroll all the way and follow this line all the way down, it comes all the way to this end. So all we ever look at in this loop are tarot cards. Okay? So we grab local data. So we do entity get data, we get the sprite. Entity get sprite. Whew. So we've got some sort of tarot card on the floor. Then we check if it's being picked up. We use the same pickup code that we used from the custom pickups episode. So if the sprite is playing collect, and data.picked is nil, then data.picked is true, and we set the rune cooldown. Because if we pick something up, we might drop a rune right away. We don't want to re-roll a rune that was just in our inventory. Or we don't want to bait and switch it. We don't. It should stay the type it was. So we add a rune cooldown here. I haven't fine-tuned how long this needs to be. 30 frames is plenty long. It could probably get away with being shorter. Can work with that in the future. So that's on pickup. Don't bait and switch. Now on drop. So input is action pressed, action drop, either on the keyboard or on the controller, wherever. Then we set the cooldown, because if they're actively dropping it, again, don't bait and switch something that was just dropped. Don't do it. So those are the two primary prevention mechanisms. There's another type, but we'll get to that in a second. Now we're doing initialization. So we look at the rune on the ground and see, has it been initialized? If it's nil, it has not yet been initialized, for bait and switch or otherwise. So we say, should we do bait and switch? If the rune cooldown is 0, then yes, we should at least try. This is not saying it's going to be swapped. This is just saying we should try. Then we check whether or not it's a duplicate. This is the most problematic part of the whole thing. Because how do you detect that something was just duplicated with Yera or Diplopia? There isn't a good way, because it doesn't always happen right next to it. It could be as far as the entire room across, because if you duplicate it and duplicate it some more and duplicate it some more, the more you duplicate it, the further away it might possibly be. And so you can't say, oh, if it's within 100, no. It could be all the way across the room. So this really just checks whether or not there's another rune of that type in the room somewhere. It's not great, but I don't think you're really gonna notice a problem with it. Like, it's not a perfect solution. It will prevent a bait and switch after a Yera, but it will also prevent a bait and switch after potentially other circumstances. But what it does, it checks whether or not we're trying to do a bait and switch, because if we're not allowed to because of the cooldown, it's not even worth checking. So if we're still eligible, we run through all of the room entities again. This is not super efficient, but you shouldn't have to run this very often. It is only run when a rune is spawned outside of the rune cooldown period. Runs through the entities if it's the same type, variant, and subtype, and not in the same position, so not the same rune, then don't try to bait and switch. There's already one of those runes in the room. It might have been caused, you might have come into existence because of a duplication. That's what this is checking. Checks everybody. If it's the same type and a different position, might have been duplicated, so we don't want to bait and switch. Said that enough? Yeah, following? So now we're finally at the point where, like, okay, finally, can we bait and switch? If it says we can, because this init is true only if we're eligible to do a bait and switch. Then we roll a die. We take that entity's drop RNG and grab a random float. I've got no guarantees that this will, in fact, perfectly seed things. I will need to run more tests to make sure this actually works, but it's at least a start. You get a random number between 0 and 1. If the sprite's file name in lowercase, it's so important that you check case on this, because whether or not it capitalizes it or you capitalize it is a big deal. So up here, I have this all lowercase, such that down here, get file name lowercase compared with the one I wrote, which I know is lowercase. So if the file name matches, which means it's a pointy type rune, then you check the roll versus the chance of replacement. And if you pass all of these checks, then you change the subtype to my subtype. We're not removing the rune and spawning a new one. We're just changing the subtype because the rune already exists. And then, if that wasn't the case, check if it's a dull rune. If it is, you check your roll against the chance of being hoggle, change the subtype if so. So you can subtly swap it out without actually removing and resummoning anything. That's the one, probably the only nice thing about working with the runes, is the bait and switch is very, very simple. So are we done now? Oh, goodness, no. Because, like I said, when the rune comes into existence directly. So if you spawn it in, so we didn't do a subtype swap. If we spawned it in directly, it has the back of a playing card. It's not a sharp rune or a dull rune, it's a playing card. Oh, well, that's frustrating, isn't it? So if it came into existence directly, then we check the subtype. If it's ours, we grab the sprite, which probably has already been loaded. Yeah, we don't actually need this. We don't need this. Because sprite was loaded up here. Again, when you work with a lot of code and you're moving things around, you don't always catch everything that shouldn't be there anymore. So we take the sprite, we get the file name. If it's not rune 1, so if it's not a pointy rune, we make it a pointy rune. So if it's a playing card, tarot card, whatever. If it's not what it should be, then you take the sprite, you load in rune 1, which is this entity and M2 file. We do want to load the graphics this time. With the giant book, we didn't want to load the graphics. With this, for the entity, the way it looks, absolutely we do. And then we play appear, because this should only happen when it just came into existence. So we play appear, whoop, and there it is. If you didn't actually tell it to play appear, it would swap it to the rune shape, but it would be completely still. It wouldn't do that little bounce that it does when it comes into existence. So here's swapping the card back if you summoned it through the console, or if something somehow magically summoned it into existence. I say something because Rune Bag and any sort of anything that summons random runes will never summon the modded ones. At least in my testing, I set it to summon random cards and runes every frame, and it removed the extras. And it never summoned my custom ones. Not without the bait and switch. With the bait and switch, it's fine. But without the bait and switch, they never come into existence. That's why we need the bait and switch. Eventually, they might fix it such that the runes you add via pocketitems.xml will show up naturally in the game, but until then, bait and switch is how we have to do it. Similarly to the back. Eventually, they might make it work in a more intuitive way, but until then, we can make it work the way we want to. Whew. It's a lot of things that I've thrown at you this episode. We're 34 minutes in, but I have covered everything. We've covered the giant book. We've covered actually making it work. We've covered how to get this ID number such that you don't trigger all of the rune effects all at once. We've covered splitting up the giant book process from starting the animation when you play when you use the card to trying to draw the giant book in render and progressing the frames in the update. You look at all the things in the room and decide, do we want to bait and switch? And if you can, then you do it. And you always swap out the card back for the rune. So many things, so little time. Always make sure to tune your chance of it appearing. 0.5 is no good. You want it way lower than that. Get card ID by name is actually getting it by the HUD value. And whenever you load sprites, you only have to do it once. That's all I've got for you this episode. I will see you in the next episode of the Modding of Isaac with Lyte.